The cleaner was fired for theft, and the millionaire saw a necklace fall from her bag. The same one he gave to his late beloved 18 years ago. The soft hum of the vacuum cleaner echoed through the wide office hallways, accompanied by the faint shuffle of Emma Johnson's worn-out sneakers against the polished floors. It was late, long past the time when the company's high-ranking executives had left for their lavish dinners and cozy homes. For Emma, this was just another ordinary evening in the endless cycle of work and responsibility that defined her life. Emma paused for a moment, leaning against her cart of cleaning supplies. She glanced at her reflection in the glass wall beside her, noting the tiredness etched into her face. Her chestnut hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her oversized uniform hung loosely on her petite frame. Despite everything, there was a quiet resilience in her brown eyes, a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out with one hand, while clutching a rag in the other. A picture of her 5-year-old son. Ethan illuminated the screen. It was a message from Mrs. Turner, her elderly neighbor who looked after Ethan while Emma worked late. "Ethan's asleep now. He had a good dinner. Don't worry, dear." Emma smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Ethan was her world. The reason she pushed through long hours and endured the daily whispers and sneers from her coworkers. She typed a quick thank you and tucked the phone away, her thoughts drifting to her little boy. His laughter was her solace after exhausting days. His curiosity a reminder that life could still hold joy. The whispers started as soon as Emma turned a corner. Two of her co-workers, Carla and Denise, leaned casually against a desk, their voices low but loud enough for Emma to hear. "She thinks she's better than us," Carla muttered, casting a sideways glance at Emma. "She's just lucky she's pretty," Denise added with a smirk. "But how long do you think that'll last? Hard work shows on a face like hers." Emma clenched her jaw and kept walking, her grip tightening on the handle of her cart. She had learned long ago not to respond. Words from people like Carla and Denise were designed to sting, but Emma refused to let them see her falter. Her shift dragged on, each task blending into the next. The offices, with their sleek furniture and framed awards on the walls, felt like a world apart from Emma's cramped apartment. She often wondered what it would be like to sit behind one of those desks, to feel respected and valued instead of invisible. But dreaming didn't pay bills or put food on the table. At midnight, Emma clocked out and stepped into the brisk Chicago night. The city was alive with activity. Even at this hour, cars honked in the distance, and the smell of street food wafted through the air. She pulled her coat tighter around her and hurried toward the bus stop, eager to get home to Ethan. When she finally entered her tiny apartment, the sight of her son asleep on the couch made her pause. His small chest rose and fell steadily, his face peaceful. A well-worn blanket covered him, and a book lay open beside him, one of his favorites about astronauts and far-off planets. Emma knelt beside him, brushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead. "Mommy's home, baby," she whispered, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. She slipped the amulet from around her neck, the small golden moon catching the dim light. It was the only thing she had left of her mother, a woman shrouded in mystery and heartbreak. Emma often found herself clutching it in moments of doubt, as if it held the answers to questions she didn't dare ask. Placing the amulet on the counter, Emma sank into the single armchair in the living room, exhaustion washing over her. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, a relentless grind with no end in sight. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet, her eyes drifting closed as she listened to the comforting hum of the heater. Meanwhile, across the city in a high-rise penthouse, Richard Evans sat at his desk, poring over financial reports, the CEO of the company where Emma worked. He was a man known for his sharp instincts and unyielding demeanor. His graying hair and the lines on his face were markers of a life spent building an empire. But they also hinted at a loneliness he refused to acknowledge. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. He should have been in bed, but sleep rarely came easily these days. His thoughts wandered, as they often did, to Laura, his late wife, whose absence had left a void no amount of success could fill. On his desk sat a photograph of Laura, her smile frozen in time. Around her neck was a golden amulet, identical to the one Emma had just placed on her counter. Richard sighed, closing the folder in front of him. Tomorrow was another day, another round of battles to fight. Little did he know, tomorrow would bring more than he ever expected. a confrontation with a past he thought he had buried, and a truth that would change everything. Emma walked into the office the next morning, her head held high despite the exhaustion tugging at her. She was used to starting her day before the sun rose, juggling her responsibilities as a mother and her job. The whispers and glances from her coworkers were part of her daily routine, but today felt different. There was an edge to the murmurs, a sharpness that made her skin prickle. Carla and Denise were huddled near the break room, their voices barely lowered as Emma passed. "Can you believe it? The necklace from Mr. Evans's private collection gone just like that?" Carla said, her tone dripping with faux concern. "Bet I know who took it," Denise replied, shooting a glance in Emma's direction. "People like her don't pass up a chance like that." Emma stiffened but didn't stop. She had no idea what they were talking about, but the insinuation was clear. Reaching the janitorial closet, she grabbed her supplies and pushed her cart toward the executive floor. By mid-morning, the tension in the air had thickened. Emma noticed the furtive glances from other employees and the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her nerves were frayed. It wasn't until lunchtime that the hammer fell. 2 security guards approached her in the break room, their expressions unreadable. "Emma Johnson, you need to come with us," one of them said. Her stomach dropped. "Is something wrong?" "You'll find out soon enough," the other replied curtly, motioning for her to follow. They led her to the top floor, where Richard Evans's office loomed like a fortress of glass and steel. The grandeur of the space felt oppressive, and Emma's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she stepped inside. Richard was seated behind his massive desk, his sharp blue eyes fixed on her. His presence was as commanding as ever, but there was a coldness in his gaze that made Emma's breath hitch. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his tone clipped. "A valuable item has gone missing from the company safe. A necklace, to be specific. One of great sentimental and monetary value." Emma blinked, confusion washing over her. "I don't understand. What does that have to do with me?" Richard leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "We have reason to believe you're involved." The accusation hit her like a blow. "What? I would never—" "Spare me the denials," he interrupted, his voice firm. "The evidence is circumstantial, but damning nonetheless. You were seen near the safe area shortly before the item disappeared." Emma's mind raced. She had cleaned the executive floor the previous evening, as she always did, but she hadn't gone near the safe. The implication that she had stolen something was both infuriating and terrifying. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice shaking. "I was just doing my job." Richard studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're a single mother, correct? Times must be hard for you. I can understand the temptation." Emma's cheeks flushed with anger. "I'm not a thief," she said firmly. Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Regardless, this company cannot tolerate even the appearance of impropriety. You're dismissed, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Emma felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't do this. I need this job. My son. I suggest you collect your things and leave quietly," Richard said, cutting her off. "There's no point in dragging this out." Tears stung Emma's eyes as she turned and left the office, the weight of the accusation pressing down on her like a boulder. Back at her station, she packed her belongings into a small bag, her hands trembling. Her coworkers watched from a distance, some with smug satisfaction, others with faint sympathy as she reached for her amulet, which had slipped out of her shirt during the confrontation. The chain snapped, and it fell to the floor with a soft clink. Emma crouched to pick it up, but a shadow fell over her. Richard had followed her. He knelt and picked up the amulet before she could reach it. The small golden moon glinted in the fluorescent light, catching his attention. For a moment, he didn't speak. His eyes were fixed on the pendant, his expression shifting from irritation to something Emma couldn't quite place. Shock, perhaps, or disbelief. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly low and unsteady. Emma frowned, confused by the change in his demeanor. "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "She gave it to me before she disappeared." Richard stared at the amulet as if it held a secret only he could see. His hand trembled slightly as he turned it over, inspecting the intricate details. This is impossible," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Emma stood, her confusion deepening. Why? What's wrong? He looked up at her, his face pale. This amulet, he said slowly, is identical to one I gave to my wife. It was custom made. There's no other like it. Emma's heart skipped a beat. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed the amulet back to her, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, he said finally. Not here, not now, but soon. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing alone in the middle of the office, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to answer. Emma stood frozen in the middle of the office, her bag hanging loosely at her side and the amulet clutched tightly in her hand. Richard's reaction replayed in her mind, over and over again, his words ringing with a strange intensity. This is impossible. What did he mean? How could her mother's amulet be connected to him? The curious glances from co-workers brought her back to the present. She could still feel their eyes on her, waiting for her next move, as if her humiliation wasn't already enough. Taking a deep breath, she hoisted her bag onto her shoulder and walked out of the office for what she thought would be the last time. The cold air outside felt sharp against her skin, but it cleared her head. The city bustled around her, indifferent to her turmoil. Her mind, however, was a storm of questions and half-formed thoughts. Who was Richard Evans, really? Why did this amulet, a piece of her past, one she had always held close, seem to hold such significance to him? When she arrived home, Ethan greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, running into her arms with a wide grin. "Mommy, look what I made at school today," he exclaimed, holding up a drawing of a rocket blasting through the stars. Emma smiled, her worries momentarily set aside. "That's amazing." "Sweetheart," she said, kneeling down to examine the picture. Ethan beamed, but his expression quickly turned serious as he noticed the tired look on her face. "Are you okay, Mommy?" Emma brushed a hand through his dark hair. "I'm fine, baby. Just a long day." After settling Ethan with a snack and his favorite show, Emma sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the amulet in her hand. Its intricate design shimmered faintly under the dim light, the tiny crescent moon surrounded by delicate stars etched into the surface. She had always thought of it as a comforting token from her mother, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Even when the world felt impossibly hard, now it felt like a key to something she didn't yet understand. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. The screen showed an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, she answered, "Ms. Johnson." Richard's voice came through the line, low and measured. Emma's stomach twisted. "Mr. Evans?" she said cautiously. "I need to speak with you," he said, privately. "Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" She glanced at Ethan, his small figure curled up on the couch. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she replied. "Please," Richard said, his tone softening. "I believe I owe you an explanation, and I think you deserve answers." Emma hesitated. She wanted answers, yes, but the idea of meeting him again, after everything that had happened, made her anxious. Still, there was a part of her that needed to know what he meant when he looked at her amulet with such shock. "All right," she said finally. "Where?" Richard gave her the address of a small cafe downtown. "I'll see you at 10, he said, before hanging up. The next morning, Emma stood outside the cafe, her nerves fraying. It was a modest place, far removed from the grandeur of Richard's office. She stepped inside and spotted him immediately. Sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him, he looked different here, less imposing, more human. His sharp suit was replaced by a simple sweater and jacket, and his normally stern expression was replaced by something softer. "Ms. Johnson," he greeted as she approached. "Emma," she corrected. Sitting across from him, Richard nodded. "Emma," he said. There was a moment of silence between them, the weight of unspoken words filling the air. Finally, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table toward her. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she picked it up. The image showed a woman, her smile radiant and her eyes warm. Around her neck was the same amulet Emma now held in her hand. "This is my late wife, Laura," Richard said quietly. "She was wearing that amulet the day she died. It was custom made, a one-of-a-kind piece. Emma's heart raced. My mother's name was Laura, she said, her voice trembling. She disappeared when I was a little girl. I don't remember much about her. Richard leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. Emma, I think your mother and my wife are the same person. The words hit her like a tidal wave. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind struggling to process the revelation. That can't be, she said, shaking her head. It doesn't make sense. She wouldn't have left me. Richard's expression was pained. I don't know what happened to her after she left me. We had difficulties in our marriage. I wasn't the easiest man to live with. When she died, I was told our child, my child, had been sent to an orphanage. I tried to find you, but it was as if you'd vanished. Emma's eyes filled with tears. So, you're saying... I'm saying I believe you're my daughter, Richard said, his voice breaking. And I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner. The cafe seemed to fade around her, the noise of clinking cups and murmured conversations drowned out by the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Emma stared at the man sitting across from her, the man who had accused her, dismissed her, and now claimed to be her father. I need time, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, his face etched with regret. Take all the time you need, he said. But please, let me try to make this right. Emma spent the rest of the day in a haze, her thoughts tangled with disbelief, anger, and an unshakable sense of loss. The revelation that Richard Evans, her boss, her accuser, might actually be her father was too much to process. She tried to go about her usual routine, making lunch for Ethan and tidying their small apartment. But her mind kept drifting back to that cafe, to the photograph, and to Richard's trembling voice as he uttered the words, I believe you're my daughter. Ethan, always perceptive, noticed her distraction. Mommy, are you okay? He asked, his small hand tugging at her sleeve as she sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television. Emma managed a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, sweetheart, she said, pulling him into her lap. Just a little tired. Ethan didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push. He rested his head on her shoulder, and Emma held him tightly, drawing comfort from his warmth. That evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Emma sat at the kitchen table with the amulet in her hand. She traced its edges with her thumb, her mind replaying fragments of memories from her childhood, the gentle hum of her mother's voice, the scent of her perfume, the feel of her arms around her. But those memories were fleeting, fragmented by the passage of time and the pain of abandonment. Could Richard really be telling the truth? And if he was, why had her mother kept such a monumental secret from him, and from her? The questions swirled in her mind, keeping her awake long after midnight. The next morning, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. Good morning, Emma. I found some records that may help explain everything. Would you meet me again? I'll come to you this time. Emma stared at the message for a long moment. She wanted answers, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to face him again so soon. Still, the weight of uncertainty was too much to bear. Okay, she replied. Come to my apartment at 10. At precisely 10 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Emma opened it to find Richard standing there, holding a slim folder. He looked more subdued than usual, his normally sharp appearance softened by a weariness that mirrored her own. Thank you for letting me come, he said. Stepping inside, his gaze drifted briefly to Ethan, who was sitting on the floor with his toys. Let's talk in the kitchen, Emma said, leading him away from Ethan's curious eyes. They sat across from each other at the small table, and Richard placed the folder between them. These are the adoption records I found, he said, sliding the folder toward her. It's not much, but it's all I could uncover about what happened to you after Laura's death. Emma hesitated before opening the folder. Inside, she found a few pages of documents, including a certificate from the orphanage she had lived in as a child. Her name was listed as Emma Laura Johnson. My mother gave me her name, Emma murmured, running her fingers over the paper. Richard nodded. It was the only clue I had to go on, but every time I tried to locate you, I hit a dead end. The records were incomplete, and He trailed off, his voice heavy with regret. I should have tried harder. Emma looked up at him, her emotions a turbulent mix of anger and longing. "Why didn't she tell you about me?" she asked. Richard's face tightened. "I don't know," he admitted. "Laura and I had our problems, but I never imagined she would keep something like this from me. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she thought it was better for you not to be caught up in our troubles." Emma swallowed hard, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "I grew up thinking I didn't matter to anyone," she said quietly. "Do you know what that does to a child?" Richard's expression crumpled, and he reached across the table, his hand hovering uncertainly before finally settling over hers. "I can't change the past," he said. "But I swear to you, Emma, if you let me, I'll do everything I can to make things right from now on." Emma pulled her hand away, not ready to accept his gesture of comfort. "I don't even know who you are," she said. "You've accused me, judged me, and now you're telling me you're my father. How am I supposed to trust you?" Richard looked down, his shoulders slumping. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he said, "but I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that I mean what I say." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Ethan's laughter from the living room. Richard glanced toward the sound, his expression softening. "He's a good boy," he said. "You've done an incredible job raising him." Emma felt a pang of pride and protectiveness. "He's my whole world," she said. Richard nodded, his gaze lingering on the doorway. "Maybe I could get to know him too," he said tentatively. Emma hesitated, her instinct to shield Ethan clashing with the possibility of giving him the family she never had. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Richard nodded, seeming to understand the weight of her words. As he stood to leave, he turned back to her. "Thank you for listening," he said. "I'll wait for you to decide what happens next." After he left, Emma sat at the table for a long time, staring at the folder in front of her. The answers she had found only seemed to lead to more questions. But one thing was clear: her life would never be the same. Emma's days felt heavier after Richard's visit. She tried to carry on as if everything were normal, but the folder he had left behind seemed to radiate its own kind of gravity, pulling her thoughts back to the revelations she was struggling to accept. She sat at the kitchen table one evening, the folder open in front of her, its contents spread out like pieces of a puzzle. Her mother's face stared back at her from the lone photograph Richard had included, a woman she barely remembered, yet whose features she now recognized in her own reflection. Ethan climbed into her lap, pulling her attention away. "What's that, Mommy?" he asked, pointing to the photograph. Emma hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "This is someone very special," she said softly. Ethan frowned, studying the picture. "She looks like you." Emma smiled faintly. "She was my mom," she said. Ethan's eyes lit up. "Like Grandma." The word caught Emma off guard. Ethan had never known a grandmother, and now, suddenly, the concept felt foreign and bittersweet. "Yeah," she said, her voice catching. "Like a grandma." Ethan rested his head on her shoulder. Content, but Emma's mind was anything but settled. The following day, Emma decided she couldn't keep sitting with her questions. She needed more answers, even if they were painful. She texted Richard, asking to meet again. Richard responded quickly, suggesting they meet at a park near her apartment. When she arrived, she found him waiting on a bench, a thermos of coffee in hand. "Emma," he greeted, standing as she approached. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative. She sat down beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of children playing and birds chirping filling the space between them. Finally, Emma spoke. "I need to know more about her," she said. "About my mom." Richard nodded, unscrewing the lid of the thermos and pouring 2 cups. "Laura was incredible," he began, his voice softening as he spoke her name. "She was kind, patient, and so full of life. When I met her, I thought I'd found the one person who could make me a better man." Emma listened intently, her chest tightening with a mix of longing and anger. "But our marriage wasn't perfect," Richard continued. "I was too focused on my career. I didn't always make time for her, and I know now how much that hurt her." He paused, staring at the coffee in his hands. "When she told me she was pregnant, I was overjoyed. But something changed in her. She became distant, anxious. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back..." "What happened?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard took a deep breath. "She left," he said. "One day she just Disappeared. I searched for her everywhere, months later. I found out she had been in a car accident. He looked at Emma, his eyes filled with regret. They told me you'd been sent to an orphanage, but when I tried to find you, the records were incomplete. It felt like you'd vanished into thin air. Emma's hands trembled in her lap. She left because of you, she said, her voice laced with bitterness. Richard flinched but didn't deny it. I think she was scared, he said. Maybe she thought she couldn't raise you in the life we had together. Maybe she thought you'd be better off without me. Emma stood abruptly, pacing a few steps away. The weight of his words pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. I grew up thinking no one wanted me, she said, her voice shaking. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To wonder, every single day, why you weren't enough for someone to stay? Richard rose, his expression anguished. Emma, No, she interrupted, spinning to face him. You don't get to apologize and pretend this makes everything better. I lost my mother, my childhood, everything. And now you show up, expecting me to just accept this, to accept you. Richard's shoulders slumped. I don't expect anything, he said quietly. But I'm here now, and I want to be here. For you. For Ethan, if you'll let me. Emma stared at him, her anger and pain warring with the small, fragile hope that had begun to take root in her heart. Give me time, she said finally, her voice steady but distant. Richard nodded. Take all the time you need, he said. But please, don't shut me out completely. That evening, Emma sat with Ethan on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around him as he drifted off to sleep. She thought about Richard's words, about the pieces of her past that were finally coming together, even if they didn't yet make sense. She glanced at the amulet, still hanging around her neck. It felt heavier now, not just a token of her mother, but a link to a family she hadn't known existed. For the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere, to have a father, to let Ethan grow up with a sense of family. But the fear of being hurt again loomed large, and she wasn't sure she could take that risk. Her phone buzzed with a message from Richard. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. Emma stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone aside. She wasn't ready yet, but maybe, just maybe, she could get there. The next few days passed in a blur. Emma carried on as best as she could, focusing on Ethan and their routine, but Richard's words lingered in her mind. Each time she looked at her son's bright, curious eyes, or heard his infectious laughter, she wondered if letting Richard into their lives might give Ethan something she never had, a real family. But fear and doubt held her back. Trusting Richard felt like stepping onto unsteady ground, and she wasn't sure if it would hold or crumble beneath her. On a quiet Saturday morning, Emma finally decided she couldn't avoid the questions any longer. She sent a message to Richard, asking if he would come by later that day. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say, but she knew she needed to confront the unresolved feelings swirling within her. At 3 o'clock sharp, there was a knock at the door. Emma opened it to find Richard standing there, holding a small bouquet of daisies. The gesture caught her off guard. She wasn't sure whether to feel touched or wary. These are for you, Richard said, his voice tentative. I don't know, maybe they'd brighten your day. Emma accepted the flowers with a nod, her expression neutral. Thanks, come in. Richard stepped inside, his gaze immediately falling on Ethan, who was sitting on the floor with his toy cars. The little boy looked up, his face lighting up with curiosity. Hi, Ethan said, tilting his head. Hi there, Richard replied, crouching slightly to meet Ethan's eye level. You must be Ethan. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. Who are you? Emma froze, unsure how to answer, before she could speak. Richard smiled gently. I'm a friend of your mom's, he said. Ethan considered this for a moment, then grinned. Do you like cars? I do, Richard said. I used to play with cars just like those when I was your age. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? Richard nodded. Really? Ethan picked up one of his favorite cars and held it out to Richard. You can borrow this one. It's the fastest. Richard chuckled, taking the small car in his hand. Thank you. I'll take good care of it. Emma watched the exchange from the kitchen, her emotions a tangled mess. Seeing Ethan interact with Richard felt both heartwarming and terrifying. She couldn't deny the genuine kindness in Richard's demeanor, but letting him into Ethan's life meant risking everything. If things went wrong, later, after Ethan had gone to his room to draw, Emma and Richard sat at the kitchen table. The tension between them was palpable, but Richard seemed determined to bridge the gap. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. "I know this isn't easy for you." Emma nodded, fiddling with the edge of the table. "It's not," she admitted. "But Ethan, he liked you." Richard's face softened. "He's a wonderful kid. You've done an amazing job raising him." Emma looked away, her chest tightening. "I've done the best I could, but it hasn't been easy." Richard hesitated before speaking. "I want to help, Emma, not just financially, but I want to be here for you and Ethan, whatever that looks like." Emma shook her head, her emotions spilling over. "You don't get to just show up and fix everything, Richard. I've spent my whole life not knowing who I was, where I came from, and now you expect me to just accept this?" Richard leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I don't expect that. I just want a chance to be the father I should have been all along. I know I can't make up for the past, but I can try to make things better now." Emma's voice wavered. "What if it's too late?" "It's not," Richard said firmly. "It's never too late to try." Their conversation was interrupted by Ethan running into the room, clutching one of his drawings. "Look," he exclaimed, holding it up for both of them to see. The picture showed 3 figures, a woman, a little boy, and a man standing together under a bright yellow sun. "It's us," Ethan said proudly. Emma's breath caught as she looked at the drawing. Richard stared at it too, his eyes glistening. "It's beautiful," Richard said softly. Ethan beamed. "Do you want to keep it?" he asked, offering the picture to Richard. Richard accepted it with reverence, as though it were the most valuable thing he'd ever been given. "Thank you, Ethan. I'll treasure this." Ethan grinned and ran back to his room, leaving Emma and Richard alone again. Emma let out a shaky breath, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "He's so quick to trust," she said. "I don't want him to get hurt." Richard met her gaze, his voice steady. "Neither do I. That's why I'm here, to show both of you that I'm not going anywhere." Emma's walls cracked. Just a little. She wasn't ready to fully trust him yet, but she couldn't deny that he was trying. "I don't know what this looks like yet," she said cautiously, "but I'll give you a chance, for Ethan." Richard nodded, relief washing over his face. "That's all I can ask for." As Richard left that evening, Emma stood at the window, watching him walk to his car. Her heart felt heavier and lighter all at once. She had taken the first step toward letting him in, but the journey ahead still felt uncertain. For Ethan's sake, and maybe her own, she hoped she hadn't made a mistake. The days that followed were cautiously optimistic. Emma had allowed Richard into her and Ethan's lives, but she kept her guard up. The wounds of her past were still fresh, and trusting Richard, no matter how sincere he seemed, felt like walking a tightrope without a net. Richard, however, was persistent in his quiet, unassuming way. He began showing up on weekends, bringing small gifts for Ethan, a toy car, a set of crayons, a puzzle shaped like a spaceship. Ethan adored him, and his joyful laughter filled the apartment each time Richard visited. Emma couldn't deny that Richard was trying. He was patient, never pushing too hard or overstepping boundaries. Still, she struggled to let go of her fear. Could a man who had accused her so quickly really become the father she'd always needed? One crisp Saturday morning, Richard arrived with an invitation. "I thought we could spend the day together," he said, handing Emma a flyer for the Children's Science Museum. "There's an exhibit on space exploration, and I thought Ethan might like it." Emma glanced at Ethan, whose eyes lit up at the mention of space. He ran to her side, tugging at her hand. "Please, Mommy, can we go?" Emma hesitated. The idea of spending an entire day with Richard in public felt daunting, but Ethan's excitement was infectious, and she couldn't bear to disappoint him. "All right," she said, smiling at her son. "Let's go." The museum was buzzing with families, children darting from one exhibit to the next, while parents tried to keep up. Ethan was in his element, running between displays of rockets and planets. His small face glowing with wonder, Richard walked beside Emma, his pace unhurried. "He's a bright kid," he said, watching Ethan point excitedly at a model of the solar system. "He is," Emma replied, her voice soft. He loves learning about space. Says he wants to be an astronaut one day. Richard smiled. With that determination, I wouldn't be surprised if he makes it. Emma couldn't help but smile too, her defenses momentarily lowering. It was hard to stay guarded when Richard spoke with such genuine admiration for Ethan. As the day went on, Emma found herself relaxing. She and Richard talked more openly, sharing small stories about their lives. Richard spoke of his early days in business, the mistakes he'd made, and the lessons he'd learned. Emma told him about her struggles as a single mother, the sacrifices she'd made to give Ethan a stable life. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of understanding between them. At lunch, they sat at a small table in the museum's cafe, Ethan chattering nonstop about his favorite exhibits. Richard listened attentively, asking questions that made Ethan light up with excitement. "You know," Richard said, pulling a pen from his pocket and sketching a quick rocket on a napkin. "I used to build model rockets when I was a kid. Maybe we could build one together sometime." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really? Can we, Mommy?" Emma hesitated, glancing at Richard. He met her gaze with a small, hopeful smile. "We'll see," she said, her tone cautious but not dismissive. Ethan grinned, satisfied with the answer, and returned to his sandwich. As the day wound down, Richard walked them back to their apartment. Ethan was half asleep in his mother's arms, his small hands clutching a souvenir rocket from the museum gift shop. "Thank you for today," Emma said as they reached her door. "Ethan had a great time." Richard nodded, his expression soft. "So did I. It felt normal, like family." Emma looked away, unsure how to respond. The word family still felt foreign, like something fragile she wasn't ready to claim. Richard seemed to sense her hesitation. "I know this is all new," he said gently, "but I want you to know, I'm here. Whatever you need, however long it takes. I'm not going anywhere." Emma nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Good night, Richard." "Good night," he said, his voice warm. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Emma sat in the quiet living room, her thoughts swirling. The day had been unexpectedly pleasant, even comforting. Richard had been patient, kind, and attentive, not the harsh, judgmental man who had fired her weeks ago. But could she truly trust this new version of him? Or was it just a matter of time before he let her down, like so many others had? She glanced at the amulet hanging around her neck, the small golden moon catching the light. It was a reminder of her mother, of the family she'd lost, and now, perhaps, of the one she might have a chance to rebuild. Emma sighed, leaning back against the couch. For Ethan's sake, she decided, she would try. She wasn't ready to fully open her heart to Richard, but she would take it one step at a time. The next morning, Emma sent Richard a text. "Ethan would like to build that rocket with you. Let me know when you're free." His reply came almost instantly. "I'll bring the supplies this weekend." Emma smiled faintly, tucking her phone away for the first time in a long while. She felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Emma felt the weight of uncertainty lifting slightly as her connection with Richard began to strengthen. While she was still hesitant to fully embrace him as her father, she couldn't deny that he was making an effort, not just for her, but for Ethan. Yet, even as her personal life showed small signs of progress, the memory of her abrupt dismissal from the company lingered. Her name had been tarnished, her reputation dragged through the mud by an accusation she hadn't deserved. It wasn't just about the job, it was about justice. Emma had always prided herself on her integrity, and the idea that her co-workers might still see her as a thief gnawed at her. One afternoon, as she was cleaning up after lunch, her phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "I have news about what happened at the office. Can we meet to discuss it?" Emma stared at the screen, her heart quickening. She quickly replied, "Sure, come over after dinner." Later that evening, Richard arrived, his expression serious as he stepped inside. He carried a folder under his arm and handed it to Emma as they sat at the kitchen table. "I've been doing some investigating," he said, "and I think it's time we set the record straight." Emma opened the folder, her brow furrowing as she scanned the contents. Inside were security reports, emails, and even a signed confession from one of her former co-workers. "It was Carla," Richard said, his tone steady but tinged with anger. "She forged the theft report and planted evidence to frame you. I suspect jealousy had something to do with it." though I don't know all the details. Emma's stomach churned as she read through the documents. Carla's actions had cost her not just her job, but also her dignity. "Why didn't anyone figure this out sooner?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I take responsibility for that," Richard admitted. "I should have looked deeper before jumping to conclusions. I failed you, Emma, but I'm going to fix this." Emma glanced up at him, her emotions swirling. "What are you going to do?" Richard leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. "I've already started the process to clear your name. Carla has been terminated, and I'm issuing a formal statement to the company, as well as a recommendation for any position you want. You don't have to come back, of course, but I want you to know the door is open." Emma stared at him, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and lingering resentment. "Why are you doing all this now?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Richard said simply, "and because I owe it to you." A week later, the company issued a formal statement clearing Emma of any wrongdoing. Her name was restored, and the news quickly spread among her former co-workers. The following day, Emma found herself standing outside the building she'd once worked in. She had no intention of returning, but she felt a need to see it one last time, to reclaim some sense of closure. As she stepped into the lobby, a few familiar faces turned toward her. Some offered sheepish smiles, while others avoided her gaze entirely. Carla was nowhere to be seen, and Emma felt a flicker of satisfaction knowing the woman who had tried to destroy her had been held accountable. "Emma," a voice called. She turned to see Denise, one of the co-workers who had once spread rumors about her, hurrying over. "Hi, Denise," Emma said cautiously. Denise fidgeted, her expression a mix of guilt and nervousness. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said. "We were wrong about you. I was wrong." Emma studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. Denise seemed relieved and quickly returned to her desk. Emma turned to leave, but as she reached the door, she spotted Richard standing nearby, watching her. He walked over, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said. "I needed to," Emma replied. "For myself," Richard nodded. "How do you feel?" "Better," she admitted, "but it doesn't change what happened." "No, it doesn't," Richard said, "but I hope it's a step towards something better." Emma met his gaze, and for the first time she felt a flicker of trust. Maybe it is. That evening, back at the apartment, Emma reflected on how far she'd come. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that office every day, exhausted and invisible. She had found her voice, her strength, and perhaps in some small way, her family. Ethan ran into the room, clutching a piece of paper. "Look, Mommy, I made another drawing." Emma smiled as she took the picture from him. It showed the three of them again, her, Ethan, and Richard, standing together under a big, bright moon. "Do you think Grandpa would like it?" Ethan asked, his eyes shining. Emma hesitated, then nodded. "I think he'd love it." As Ethan ran off to find his crayons, Emma stared at the drawing, her heart full of complicated emotions. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where they really could be a family, a future where trust, forgiveness, and love might finally take root. The sun filtered through the thin curtains in Emma's living room as Ethan sat on the floor, carefully arranging the rocket parts Richard had brought over. His small hands worked with precision, guided by Richard's calm instructions. Emma watched from the couch, sipping her coffee, the scene both surreal and heartwarming. "Careful with that piece," Richard said, pointing to one of the fins. "If it's not aligned, the rocket won't fly straight." Ethan nodded seriously, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Like this. Perfect," Richard said, smiling. Emma couldn't help but smile too. Seeing Ethan so engaged, working side by side with Richard, felt like a glimpse into a world she never thought she'd have. A world where her son had a grandfather and where the weight of her own past didn't feel so heavy. "You're good with him," Emma said softly, breaking the silence. Richard glanced up at her, his expression warm. "He makes it easy," he said. "He's a great kid. That's a testament to you." Emma's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "I've just done what I had to," she said. Richard set down one of the rocket pieces and leaned back. "Emma, you've done more than that. You've raised a kind, smart, and curious boy. That's no small thing." She didn't reply, but his words lingered, their sincerity chipping away at her defenses. As the rocket neared completion, Ethan clapped his hands in excitement. "Can we launch it today?" Richard chuckled. "Not today, buddy. The paint needs to dry first. But next weekend, we'll take it to the park and see how high it can go." Ethan nodded eagerly, already planning what colors to use for the finishing touches. After lunch, Richard prepared to leave. But before he walked out the door, Ethan ran up to him and hugged him tightly. "Thanks, Grandpa," he said, his voice muffled against Richard's jacket. Richard froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard. But then he wrapped his arms around Ethan, his expression softening. "You're welcome, kiddo," he said. Emma stood nearby, her throat tight with emotion. Hearing Ethan call Richard Grandpa had stirred something deep within her, a mix of hope, fear, and a tentative sense of belonging. That evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Emma sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sounds of traffic outside. She stared at her phone, debating whether to text Richard. Finally, she typed out a message. "Thank you for spending time with Ethan today. It meant a lot to him. And to me." Richard's reply came quickly. "It meant a lot to me too. Thank you for letting me be part of his life." Emma set her phone down, her chest tight. She had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, guarding herself and Ethan from disappointment. But Richard was different. He wasn't just trying to make amends. He was showing up, over and over again. The following weekend, the three of them stood in an open field at the park, the freshly painted rocket gleaming in the sunlight. Richard held the launch controller, explaining to Ethan how it worked while Emma watched from a picnic blanket nearby. "Okay, countdown time," Richard said. "You ready?" Ethan nodded, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Ready?" Richard grinned. "All right, 3, 2, 1, launch." He pressed the button, and the rocket shot into the sky, a streak of red and silver against the blue. Ethan cheered, jumping up and down as the rocket reached its peak and began its descent. "Did you see that, Mommy?" Ethan shouted, running over to her. "I saw it," Emma said, laughing. "It was amazing." Richard retrieved the rocket and brought it back to Ethan, who was already begging to launch it again. As they set up for the second launch, Emma watched them with a growing sense of peace. The scene felt almost normal, something she had long stopped believing was possible for her and Ethan. After the park, they stopped for ice cream at a small shop on the way home. Ethan's face was covered in chocolate by the time they finished, and Richard teased him about looking like a raccoon. Emma laughed along with them, the sound light and genuine. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of happiness that wasn't shadowed by fear or uncertainty. That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he hugged her tightly. "I like Grandpa," he said sleepily. Emma kissed his forehead. "I know you do, sweetheart," she said. "Do you like him too?" Ethan asked, his eyes half closed. Emma hesitated, her heart catching. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I do." Ethan smiled, his breathing evening out as he drifted off to sleep. Emma sat on the couch, staring at the amulet around her neck. Her mother's memory still loomed large in her life. But now, it felt like a bridge rather than a barrier, a link to the father she was slowly beginning to trust, and the future she was cautiously beginning to hope for. Picking up her phone, she sent Richard a message. "Ethan can't stop talking about the rocket launch. Thank you for making his day so special." His reply was simple but heartfelt. "He's the one making my days special, and so are you." Emma smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. Maybe, just maybe, they were building something real, a family. The following weeks brought a sense of stability Emma hadn't experienced in years. Richard became a regular presence in their lives, stopping by after work to help Ethan with his homework or staying for dinner on weekends. His growing bond with Ethan was undeniable, and Emma couldn't help but marvel at how naturally the two of them had connected. One evening, as the three of them sat around the small dining table eating spaghetti, Ethan's favorite meal, Richard leaned back in his chair and laughed as Ethan recounted a story about his school day. And then Joey tried to kick the soccer ball, but he missed and fell right into the mud, Ethan said, giggling uncontrollably. Richard chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Sounds like Joey needs some practice," he said. Ethan nodded. "Maybe you can teach me how to kick better, Grandpa. I don't want to fall in the mud." Richard's expression softened. "I'd love to," he said. Emma watched the exchange, a quiet warmth spreading through her chest. It was moments like these, simple, unassuming, that made her wonder if she had been wrong to keep her guard up for so long. That weekend, Richard kept his promise and took Ethan to the park to practice soccer. Emma sat on the sidelines, sipping coffee as she watched them. Richard's coaching was patient but firm, and Ethan hung on his every word, determined to impress. "Keep your eye on the ball," Richard said, positioning Ethan for a kick. "And don't be afraid to follow through." Ethan nodded, his face scrunched in concentration. He swung his foot and sent the ball sailing across the field. "Great kick," Richard said, clapping. Ethan's grin was radiant as he ran to retrieve the ball. "Did you see that, Mommy?" he shouted, waving at her. "I saw it," Emma called back. "You're amazing!" Richard walked over to Emma, wiping his hands on his jeans. "He's a natural," he said, sitting down beside her. Emma smiled. "He's determined, that's for sure." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Ethan chase the ball. Then Richard spoke, his tone thoughtful. "You know, when I look at him, I see so much of you. The determination, the curiosity, even the way he tilts his head when he's thinking." Emma glanced at him, her defenses softening further. "He's my everything," she said quietly. "I can see that," Richard replied. "And you've done such an incredible job raising him, but I'd like to help now, if you'll let me. Not just with him, but with you." Emma's chest tightened. "I don't need your money, Richard," she said firmly. "I'm not talking about money," Richard said. "I'm talking about support, being here for you, for both of you." Emma hesitated, her emotions a tangle of hope and fear. "I'm still figuring out how to trust you," she admitted. "And I'll give you all the time you need," Richard said. "I'm not going anywhere." That evening, as they walked back to the car, Ethan held Richard's hand tightly. "Can we do this again next weekend?" he asked. "Of course," Richard said, smiling down at him. "Maybe we can even play a game." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Like a real soccer game." "Exactly," Richard said. "You, me, and your mom against anyone brave enough to face us." Ethan laughed, already imagining the match. When they reached the car, Richard knelt to Ethan's level. "I had a great time today," he said. "Thank you for letting me be your coach." Ethan hugged him tightly. "You're the best, Grandpa." Richard's expression softened, and Emma felt a pang of emotion as she watched them. Seeing Ethan so happy, so loved, was worth every ounce of uncertainty she felt. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Emma sat on the couch with her phone in hand. She stared at Richard's number, debating whether to call or text him. Finally, she typed out a message. "Thank you for today. Ethan had so much fun. I think he really looks up to you." Richard's reply came almost immediately. "The feeling's mutual. Thank you for letting me be part of his life." "And yours," Emma sighed, leaning back against the cushions. She had spent so long building walls around herself and Ethan, afraid of letting anyone in. But Richard was proving, day by day, that he was here to stay. For the first time, Emma allowed herself to imagine a future where Ethan grew up with a grandfather to guide him, and where she, too, might find the family she had always longed for. The next morning, Ethan bounded into the kitchen, a drawing in his hand. "Mommy, look, it's Grandpa and me playing soccer." Emma took the drawing, her heart swelling at the sight of Ethan's smiling stick figure self next to a taller figure labeled Grandpa. "Grandpa's taller than you," Ethan said matter-of-factly, pointing to the drawing. Emma laughed. "Well, he is taller than me in real life." "Too," Ethan grinned. "Do you think Grandpa can come to my school play next week?" Emma paused, caught off guard by the question. "Your school play?" Ethan nodded eagerly. "We're doing the solar system adventure. I'm going to be Mars." Emma smiled. "I'll ask him," she said. Ethan beamed, satisfied with the answer, and ran off to finish his breakfast. As Emma watched him, a sense of peace settled over her. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so uncertain. The days leading up to Ethan's school play were a whirlwind of excitement for him, and a whirlwind of emotion for Emma. Every time she saw Ethan practicing his lines or holding up his small costume with pride, she felt her chest tighten with a mix of joy and unease. Richard had eagerly accepted the invitation to attend the play. The thought of him being there, Sitting beside her in the crowded auditorium felt like another step toward something she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace fully that evening. Emma sat on the couch after Ethan had gone to bed, the apartment quiet around her. The amulet hanging from her neck felt heavier than usual, its cool surface pressed against her skin. She touched it absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting to her mother. Her mother had been the only family she'd known, and her disappearance had left a wound that never fully healed. Trusting Richard, accepting him as family, felt like a betrayal of the protective walls Emma had built around her and Ethan. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Richard. Looking forward to Ethan's big debut. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Emma hesitated before replying. He's excited. Thanks for being so supportive. She set the phone down, her heart heavy. Richard's presence in their lives was undeniably positive, but it also stirred up fears she couldn't quite articulate. What if he let them down? What if the connection he was building with Ethan ended up being temporary? The day of the play arrived, and the school was buzzing with parents, teachers, and children in colorful costumes. Ethan was dressed in a bright red shirt with a yellow circle pinned to it, representing the planet Mars. His excitement was palpable as he waved to Emma and Richard from the stage. "Look, Mommy, Grandpa," he called, earning a few chuckles from the other parents. Emma smiled and waved back, her chest tightening at the sight of Ethan's joy. Richard leaned over, his voice low. "He's got a natural stage presence." Emma laughed softly, though her nerves remained. "He's not shy, that's for sure." As the play began, Ethan delivered his lines with enthusiasm, his voice clear and confident. The sight of him beaming under the stage lights brought tears to Emma's eyes. When the play ended, the audience erupted into applause. Ethan ran toward Emma and Richard as soon as the curtain closed, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you see me?" he asked, practically bouncing on his feet. "We sure did," Richard said, lifting Ethan into a hug. "You were the best Mars I've ever seen." Ethan giggled. "Thanks, Grandpa." Emma hugged Ethan tightly, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. For a moment, all her doubts melted away. Later that evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Emma and Richard sat in the living room, the sound of the city filtering through the window. "Thank you for coming," Emma said, her voice soft. "It meant a lot to him." Richard nodded. "It meant a lot to me, too," he said. "You've done an amazing job raising him, Emma. He's a special kid." Emma looked down at her hands, her emotions churning. "Sometimes I feel like I'm barely holding it together," she admitted. Richard leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "And you don't have to do it alone anymore." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "It's hard to let people in," she said quietly. "I know," Richard said, "but I'm not going anywhere. I promise." That night, as Emma lay in bed, her mind replayed Richard's words. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he wouldn't let her or Ethan down. But the scars of her past made it hard to let go of her fears. She reached for the amulet around her neck, holding it tightly in her hand. It was a reminder of her mother's love, but also of the pain of abandonment. Could she really risk opening her heart again, as sleep finally claimed her? Emma resolved to take things one day at a time. She didn't have all the answers, but for Ethan's sake, she was willing to try. The next morning, Emma found a small envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a handwritten note from Richard. "Emma, I know this journey hasn't been easy, but I'm grateful you're letting me be part of it. Ethan's joy is a gift, and so is your strength. Please know I'm here for both of you. Always. Richard." Emma sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note. The sincerity in Richard's words touched something deep within her. Maybe, just maybe, she could start to believe in him. She placed the note in the small box where she kept her most treasured belongings. Ethan's baby pictures, her mother's old letters, and now, this small but meaningful gesture of hope. That evening, Emma called Richard. "Thank you for the note," she said. "I meant every word." Richard replied. Emma hesitated, then said, "Maybe we could all have dinner together this weekend. Ethan would love it." "I'd love that, too," Richard said, his voice warm. As Emma hung up, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe the walls she'd built around her heart didn't have to stay up forever. The weekend came quickly. and with it, a dinner that felt like a quiet milestone in Emma's journey toward trust. Richard arrived at the apartment carrying a bag of groceries, insisting on cooking for them. "I'm not a gourmet chef," he admitted with a grin, unpacking pasta, fresh vegetables, and a loaf of bread. "But I make a mean spaghetti." Ethan bounced around the kitchen, eager to help. "Can I stir the sauce? Grandpa." "Absolutely," Richard said, handing Ethan a wooden spoon. "But remember, slow and steady. We don't want a mess, right?" Ethan nodded solemnly, mimicking Richard's movements as he stirred the bubbling pot. Emma watched from the doorway, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of Ethan and Richard working together, their laughter filling the small kitchen. It was a scene she never thought she'd see, and the warmth it brought surprised her. Dinner was a simple but lively affair. The three of them sat around the table, sharing stories and laughing as Ethan proudly declared the spaghetti the best ever after dinner. Richard stayed to help clean up, and as Ethan ran off to play in his room, Emma found herself alone with Richard once again. "Thank you for tonight," she said, drying a plate and placing it in the cabinet. "It meant a lot to Ethan, and to me." Richard leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "It means a lot to me, too," he said. "Being part of your lives. It's something I didn't think I'd ever get." Emma set down the dishcloth, her hands fidgeting nervously. "Richard," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about Ethan, about trust." He waited patiently, sensing the weight of her words. "It's not easy for me to let people in," she admitted. "I've spent so much time building walls, protecting Ethan and myself, but I see how much he loves you, and how much effort you've made to be here for us." Richard's expression softened. "I'm not asking for everything at once," he said. "I just want a chance to be part of your lives, to help, to support you, however you'll let me." Emma nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I think I'm ready to try, for Ethan's sake, and for mine." Richard's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Emma," he said softly. "I promise I won't let you down." The next day, Emma found herself reflecting on her decision. Allowing Richard into their lives felt both liberating and terrifying. But as she watched Ethan play with his toy rocket, she realized that trust wasn't something that could be rushed. It was something built over time, one moment at a time. That afternoon, Richard invited them to his home, a spacious but surprisingly warm house on the edge of the city. Ethan was thrilled, darting from room to room as Richard showed him the various treasures he'd collected over the years. "Whoa," Ethan exclaimed, stopping in front of a model ship displayed in the living room. "Did you build this?" Richard chuckled. "I did, a long time ago. It took me weeks to get all the details right." Ethan stared at the ship in awe. "Can we build one together someday?" "I'd like that," Richard said, smiling. Emma stood back, watching the exchange with quiet gratitude. She could see the joy on Ethan's face, the ease with which he interacted with Richard. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this connection might last. As the evening wore on, Richard pulled Emma aside. "There's something I'd like to show you," he said, leading her to his study. On the desk sat a small, weathered box. Richard opened it carefully, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and small trinkets. "These were Laura's," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I kept them all these years, hoping that one day I'd find you. I thought you might want to have them." Emma's breath caught as she reached for the items. There were photographs of her mother, smiling brightly, and letters written in delicate handwriting. Among the trinkets was a small silver bracelet engraved with the words, "To my love, always." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she traced the letters with her finger. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "She loved you, Emma, more than anything. I know she'd be so proud of the woman you've become." Emma nodded, unable to speak. The weight of her mother's memory and the tentative hope for a new family settled over her like a bittersweet blanket that night. As they drove home, Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, clutching a small model plane Richard had given him. Emma glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her heart full of emotion. When they arrived home, Emma carried Ethan to his bed and tucked him in. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him sleep, her mind filled with thoughts of the future. Back in the living room, she opened the box Richard had given her and carefully laid out its contents. The photographs, the letters, the bracelet. They were pieces of a past she was only now beginning to understand. Emma picked up her phone and sent Richard a message. "Thank you for today, for everything, for..." "It meant more than I can say." His reply came quickly. "It meant a lot to me too. I'm here for you both, always." Emma set the phone down and leaned back, the weight of her doubts lifting ever so slightly. Maybe, just maybe, they were building something real. Something that could finally fill the void she had carried for so long. The following weeks felt like uncharted territory for Emma. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't alone. Richard's presence had become a constant, a steady reassurance in her life. And Ethan's. The once tense interactions between her and Richard had softened, and though the wounds of the past hadn't fully healed, they no longer felt insurmountable. Ethan, of course, adored his grandfather. Every time Richard visited, Ethan would rush to the door, ready to share his latest drawing or invention. "Grandpa, guess what I made today?" had become a regular greeting, and Richard always responded with enthusiasm, no matter how small the creation. One Saturday morning, Richard arrived at their apartment carrying a large box. Ethan's eyes lit up as he saw it. "What's in there, Grandpa?" Ethan asked, bouncing on his toes. "You'll see," Richard said with a mysterious smile. He set the box on the kitchen table and began unpacking its contents. Inside was a model train set, complete with tracks, miniature buildings, and tiny trees. Ethan gasped. "It's a whole town." "It is," Richard said, "and I thought maybe we could build it together." Emma stood in the doorway, watching as Ethan and Richard dove into the project. Richard patiently explained how the tracks connected, letting Ethan piece them together. "This can be our station," Ethan said, holding up a small building. "And this can be the park." Emma smiled as she listened to their laughter. The scene felt almost surreal, like a glimpse into a life she hadn't dared to hope for. As the day wore on, the train set slowly came to life. By late afternoon, the tracks were complete, and the tiny train was chugging along, winding through the miniature town. Ethan clapped his hands in delight, his eyes wide with wonder. "We did it," he exclaimed, throwing his arms around Richard. "Thanks, Grandpa." Richard hugged him back, his expression soft. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. Emma couldn't hold back a smile as she watched them. For so long, she had carried the weight of being everything for Ethan. His mother, his protector, his entire world. But now, seeing him so happy, so loved, she realized that maybe she didn't have to do it alone anymore. That evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Emma and Richard sat in the living room, the train set still spread out on the kitchen table. "Thank you for doing that with him," Emma said, her voice quiet but sincere. Richard shook his head. "It's me who should be thanking you," he said, "for letting me be part of his life." "Part of your life?" Emma looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her shirt. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted, "letting you in." "I know," Richard said gently, "and I don't take it for granted. I'm just grateful you've given me a chance." Emma met his gaze, her defenses softening further. "Ethan loves you," she said, "and I think I'm starting to trust you too." Richard's expression was full of quiet relief. "That means more to me than I can say," he said. Over the next few weeks, their bond continued to grow. Richard began joining them for family dinners, helping Ethan with school projects, and even attending his soccer practices. Each moment felt like another step toward building the family Emma had always longed for, but never thought she'd have. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Ethan looked up from his plate, his expression thoughtful. "Mommy, do families always live in different places?" he asked. Emma paused, caught off guard by the question. "Not always," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged. "I just thought maybe Grandpa could live with us. Then we'd always be together." Richard chuckled softly. "That's a lovely idea, Ethan. But I think your mom might need a little more space than I'd leave her if I moved in." Ethan laughed. But Emma felt her heart ache at the innocence of his question. He didn't understand the complexities of trust and healing. He just saw the love and connection they were building. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Emma sat with Richard in the living room. "He really loves you," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "And I love him," Richard replied without hesitation. "He's an incredible kid. That's all because of you." Emma looked away, her throat tight. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still figuring everything out," she admitted. Richard reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before settling over hers. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "We're in this together." Emma nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said softly. Later that night, Emma found herself holding the amulet around her neck. For so long, it had been her only connection to her mother, a symbol of love and loss. But now, it felt like something more. It was a reminder of the family she had lost and the one she was slowly rebuilding. Taking a deep breath, she sent Richard a message. "I'm starting to believe in this. In us. Thank you for not giving up on me." His reply was immediate. "Never. You and Ethan are my family, and I'm here for both of you. Always." Emma smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this new beginning wasn't just a dream. It was real, and it was hers. Emma had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her new life. Richard's presence felt less like an intrusion and more like an anchor, a quiet but steady force in her and Ethan's lives. But with every step forward, Emma felt the lingering weight of unanswered questions about her mother. One evening, as they were clearing the dinner table, Richard noticed her distant expression. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Is everything all right?" Emma hesitated, unsure if she was ready to share what had been weighing on her mind. Finally, she spoke. "It's about my mom. There are so many things I don't understand. Why did she leave? Why didn't she tell you about me?" Richard's face softened, and he pulled out a chair to sit across from her. "I've been asking myself those same questions," he admitted. "I thought maybe we could try to find some answers together." Emma's breath caught. The thought of confronting her past was daunting, but the idea of facing it alone was even more so. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned forward, his voice steady. "I've been looking into her old friends, places she might have gone before the accident. I think we could piece together what happened. If you're ready." Emma stared at him, her emotions a mix of fear and determination. "I need to know," she said quietly. The following weekend, Richard picked Emma and Ethan up early in the morning. They drove to a small town just outside the city, where Laura had spent her childhood. Richard had arranged to meet one of Laura's old friends, a woman named Margaret who still lived in the area. Margaret greeted them warmly at the door of her modest home. She was in her 70s, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, but her sharp eyes sparkled with curiosity as she looked at Emma. "You have her eyes," Margaret said, a soft smile playing on her lips. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you for seeing us," she said. They sat in Margaret's cozy living room, surrounded by shelves of books and framed photographs. Margaret spoke fondly of Laura, recounting stories of their childhood adventures and the bright, passionate woman Laura had been. "She always had this fire in her," Margaret said. "She wanted so much out of life, but she also carried a lot of pain." Emma frowned. "What kind of pain?" Margaret hesitated, her expression clouding. "She never talked about it directly, but I think she felt trapped, like she had to choose between what she wanted and what others expected of her." Emma glanced at Richard, who looked equally troubled. "Did she ever mention me?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Margaret's gaze softened. "She did. She loved you more than anything, Emma, but she was scared. She thought she'd failed you. That's why she left. To figure out how to be the mother she thought you deserved." Emma's heart ached at the words. "She didn't fail me," she whispered. Margaret reached out and squeezed Emma's hand. "I think she knew that deep down. But sometimes, fear makes us do things we can't take back." As they drove back to the city, the car was filled with a reflective silence. Ethan had fallen asleep in the back seat, clutching his favorite toy rocket, while Emma stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. "Thank you for taking me there," she said softly, breaking the silence. Richard nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. "You deserve to know." Emma glanced at him, her voice hesitant. "Do you think she was right to leave?" Richard's expression tightened. "I don't think it was about right or wrong. I think she made a choice she thought was best, even if it wasn't." Emma nodded, her chest heavy. I just wish I could have told her how much she meant to me." "You still can," Richard said. "By remembering her, by telling Ethan about her, she's still part of you, Emma." Emma let his words settle, a small flicker of peace forming in her heart. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Emma sat alone in the living room with the box of her mother's belongings. She carefully unfolded one of the letters Margaret had given her, a note Laura had written but never sent. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, I hope you can forgive me. I left because I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that leaving only created more pain. You were my light, my reason for everything, and I wish I had been stronger for you. Please know that every decision I made was out of love, even if it didn't feel that way. I hope one day you'll understand." Emma's tears fell freely as she clutched the letter to her chest. She didn't have all the answers, but this small piece of her mother's heart felt like a gift, a chance to finally let go of the anger and embrace the love that had always been there. The next day, Emma shared the letter with Richard. They sat together on the couch, the quiet hum of Ethan's cartoons in the background. "She loved you so much," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Emma nodded, her fingers tracing the delicate handwriting. "And now I know she wanted me to have a family. She wanted me to feel loved." Richard placed a hand over hers. "You do have a family, Emma. You have me and Ethan, and together we can honor her memory." Emma looked at him, her defenses crumbling further. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me find this." Richard smiled, his eyes full of quiet resolve. "It's what family does." The days following their visit to Margaret's house were transformative for Emma. The discovery of her mother's letter and the understanding it brought had lifted a burden she hadn't realized she was still carrying. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace about her past, and it allowed her to focus fully on the present and on the family she was building with Ethan and Richard. Richard, true to his word, continued to show up for them. He attended Ethan's soccer practices, helped him build new models, and even joined him in coloring books at the kitchen table. His patient, unwavering presence chipped away at Emma's remaining doubts. One crisp Saturday morning, Richard invited them to his home for a family brunch. Emma hesitated at first. She still wasn't entirely comfortable stepping into Richard's world, but Ethan's excitement won her over. "Do you think Grandpa will make pancakes?" Ethan asked, bouncing in the back seat as they drove to Richard's house. Emma smiled, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "I'm sure he will if you ask nicely." When they arrived, Richard greeted them at the door with a warm smile and, much to Ethan's delight, a platter of freshly made pancakes waiting on the dining table. After brunch, Richard led them to his backyard, where he had set up an outdoor train set for Ethan. The tracks wound through miniature tunnels and over small bridges, and Ethan's face lit up as he saw it. "Whoa, it's amazing!" Ethan exclaimed, running to the controls. Richard chuckled. "I thought you might like it. Want to give it a try?" Ethan nodded eagerly, and Richard knelt beside him, showing him how to operate the switches and adjust the speed of the train. Emma watched from a nearby bench, her heart swelling at the sight. Seeing Ethan so happy, so carefree, was everything she had ever wanted for him. Richard joined her after a while, sitting beside her as they watched Ethan guide the train along the tracks. "He's thriving," Richard said, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "That's because of you." Emma shook her head. "It's because of all of us," she said, surprising herself with the honesty in her words. Richard smiled, his eyes soft. "That means a lot to hear." Later that afternoon, as Ethan played with the train set, Richard turned to Emma with a more serious expression. "There's something I'd like to talk to you about," he said. Emma's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Richard hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, "about what it means to be part of this family, and I'd like to formalize it." Emma frowned, unsure of what he meant. "Formalize it?" "I'd like to make it official," Richard said. "I want to legally adopt Ethan as my grandson." Emma's breath caught, her emotions immediately swirling. "Richard, He held up a hand, stopping her. "I know it's a big decision," he said gently, "and I don't want to pressure you, but I love Ethan, and I love being part of his life, and yours. This isn't about replacing anyone. It's about showing him that he's part of something permanent, something stable." Emma's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this, and the weight of the decision felt overwhelming. But as she glanced at Ethan, laughing as he adjusted the train's speed, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the bond he shared with Richard. "I need to think about it," she said finally, her voice steady. Richard nodded, his expression understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need." That evening, back at home, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Richard's proposal. The idea of formally making him Ethan's grandfather felt both monumental and terrifying. She sat on the couch, holding the amulet around her neck as she often did when she needed clarity. Her thoughts drifted to her mother's letter, to the words that had brought her so much comfort. "You were my light, my reason for everything." Ethan padded into the room, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Mommy," Emma smiled, opening her arms to him. "What is it, sweetheart? Do you think Grandpa will always be here?" Ethan asked, climbing into her lap. Emma's heart ached at the question. "I think he wants to be," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" Ethan rested his head against her chest. "Because I like having a grandpa. It makes me happy." Emma kissed the top of his head, her emotions threatening to spill over. "I like having him around too," she admitted, as Ethan drifted off to sleep in her arms. Emma made her decision. The next day, Emma called Richard. "I've thought about what you said," she began, her voice steady. "And?" Richard asked, his tone cautious but hopeful. "I think it's a good idea," she said. "Ethan loves you, and I can see how much you love him. If this is what you want, then let's do it." Richard's relief was audible. "Thank you, Emma," he said. "You won't regret this, I promise." Emma smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. "I believe you." That evening, as they sat together as a family, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in years. Certainty, Richard's love for Ethan, and for her, was real, and she was finally ready to let it in. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in a future where their bond wasn't just temporary, but permanent. A future where trust, love, and family could finally take root and flourish. The day of the adoption hearing arrived with a mix of emotions. Emma sat in the courthouse waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ethan sat beside her, fidgeting with the buttons on his coat, while Richard paced a few steps away, glancing occasionally at the clock. "Are you nervous, Mommy?" Ethan asked, looking up at her with wide eyes. Emma smiled, brushing a hand through his hair. "A little," she admitted. "But this is a good thing, Ethan. It's about making sure Grandpa is officially part of our family." Ethan grinned. "He already is," Emma chuckled, her nerves easing slightly at his confidence. "You're right, sweetheart. He already is." Richard walked over and knelt in front of Ethan, his expression soft. "Are you ready, champ?" Ethan nodded eagerly. "I get to talk to the judge, right?" "That's right," Richard said, smiling. "Just tell him how you feel. Be yourself." Ethan puffed out his chest, looking determined. When their case was called, Emma felt her heart race as they entered the courtroom. The judge, an older man with kind eyes, greeted them warmly and invited them to sit. Richard spoke first, his voice steady and sincere as he explained his desire to formally adopt Ethan as his grandson. He talked about the bond they had built, the love he felt for Ethan, and his commitment to being a stable, supportive presence in his life. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stood on his tiptoes to speak into the microphone, his voice clear and full of excitement. "I love my grandpa," he said. "He plays with me, helps me with my homework, and makes me laugh. He's the best grandpa ever, and I want him to be my grandpa forever." Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to her son's heartfelt words. The judge turned to Emma, his gaze understanding. "And how do you feel about this, Miss Johnson?" Emma took a deep breath. Emma, her voice steady as she replied, "Richard has been a blessing in our lives. He's shown nothing but love and dedication to Ethan. I believe this is the right step for our family." The judge nodded, a small smile on his face. "Very well. After reviewing the case and hearing from all parties, it is clear that this adoption is in the best interest of the child. I hereby grant the petition for adoption. Congratulations." The gavel came down with a definitive sound, and the room erupted into quiet cheers. Ethan jumped out of his seat, throwing his arms around Richard. "You're officially my grandpa now." Richard hugged him tightly, his eyes glistening with tears. "I always have been, buddy." Emma watched them, her heart full as she wiped her own tears away. Later that evening, they celebrated at Richard's house. He had gone all out, decorating the dining room with balloons and a banner that read, "Our family forever." Ethan was thrilled, running around the room and showing off his new official grandson badge that Richard had made for him. As they sat down for dinner, Emma looked around the table, taking in the laughter and warmth that filled the room. For so long, she had carried the weight of loneliness and fear, but now, surrounded by her son and her father, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. Wholeness. Richard raised his glass, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "To family," he said. "To new beginnings and to the love that brought us here." "To family," Emma echoed, her voice soft but resolute. Ethan raised his glass of apple juice, grinning. "To Grandpa." Everyone laughed, the sound carrying a sense of joy and healing that felt almost tangible. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Emma and Richard sat together in the living room, a comfortable silence between them. "Thank you," Emma said finally, her voice quiet but full of sincerity. "For everything. For showing up. For staying. For proving me wrong." Richard smiled, his expression gentle. "Thank you for giving me the chance," he said. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me most, but I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you and Ethan know how much you mean to me." Emma reached for his hand, her heart full. "We know," she said, as she drove home that night. The amulet around her neck felt lighter than ever. It was no longer just a reminder of her mother's love. It was a symbol of the family she had found, the strength she had discovered within herself, and the future she was ready to embrace. Ethan stirred in the back seat, his sleepy voice breaking the quiet. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Grandma would be happy?" Emma's throat tightened, and she smiled softly. "I think she'd be very happy," she said. "She'd be proud of us." Ethan smiled, his eyes closing again as he drifted back to sleep. And as Emma drove through the quiet streets, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, with her son, her father, and the family they had built together.